What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So I want to talk about a topic that's a bit unusual for my channel, but one that I'm nevertheless quite interested in, which is whether or not Khabib and Islam and their camp as a whole, whether or not they are indeed truly humble. Because they claim to be humble, they preach humility all the time, their fans and supporters praise them for being humble, but there are also people who are skeptical about this, people who think it's a bit of a the lady doth protest too much situation, and who just don't think their actual behavior and their actual comments match the rhetoric, that they don't actually act in a humble way despite preaching it constantly. So I think this is like a nuanced topic, and there's some stuff I want to unpack about this. And I think in some ways they are humble, in some ways they are not. But one thing that I think needs to be understood at the forefront is the role of humility in the religion of Islam. Now, I'm not a Muslim and I'm not an expert in world religion, but nevertheless, I am an educated guy and I do think I have a correct grip on this topic here. And so, let's unpack it this way. Some people have claimed that the word Islam means peace, and other people have sort of objected and said, no, it actually means submission, and that sounds far more ominous, so, ooh. Now, my understanding is it is correct that the word Islam translates to submission. That is a much more accurate translation of the word than peace. The word salam actually translates to peace, so when you hear them say salam alaikum, it means peace be upon you. And you can probably just tell the word salam and Islam sound similar, and there's reason for that. But yes, Islam means submission, but it means submission in the sense of surrender, in the sense of acceptance. You are submitting to God's will. You are accepting God's will. That's why the action, the posture they assume when they pray is meant to literally be you're prostrating yourself before God. You're humbling yourself before God. And so with this, the concept of humility is first and foremost to the religion. You are meant to be humble. You are meant to humble yourself before God. So it makes sense that Khabib and company, as devout Muslims, as pious Muslims, it makes sense that they would talk about humility all the time, that it would be a thing they're constantly promoting and they're constantly reinforcing amongst themselves in their community. It makes sense they would do that. That's not just random, and it's not just a PR move that they want to be seen as humble. It's crucial to their religion. So I think that needs to be understood at the front. So are they actually humble, though? In a sense, in a kind of typical sportsman sense, I don't think they are humble at all. But in a different sense and in a sort of more nuanced and deeper sense, I think they are. So just hear me out here. In the classic sportsman concept of humility, they don't act humble at all. In fact, they act arrogant, I would say. And some people would say, no, it's not arrogance, it's confidence. And that kind of comes from the idea that, if you back it up, it's not arrogant, if you're just stating facts. But that's just not how we understand humility. And it's not how we understand humility in the context of sports. Because someone like John Jones is profoundly arrogant. Someone like John Jones was constantly, shit-talking his opponents, dismissing their abilities, and big-upping himself in his own achievements. And he was almost always correct. He was almost always, spitting facts. He was almost always, stating the truth as far as his superiority to his opponents. But that's still arrogant. No one would call John Jones a humble guy. And some of it is just, how you phrase it. It's how you emphasize things. You can think you're better than someone, and you can say you think you're going to win in a humble way. And you can still give them credit for what they're good at. You can still give them credit for their achievements, even if you think you're better than them, or even if you think your resume stacks up even better. You don't have to be a prick about it, and we all understand that. And so I feel like I need to give some examples then of where Khabib and his team have acted in that way that John Jones acts. There are several. So And don't get me wrong, I think this stuff is typically very funny. Like, I think Khabib is a naturally funny guy. I think Islam is a naturally funny guy. I like when fighters trash talk each other a bit. Like, I don't mind in the slightest. And I think their trash talk is usually pretty good. So, like, I'm not complaining on that level, but, like, it's not humble. So, like Islam's famous little quote where he said, where, you know, the who give him black belt? We have to check this. Like that whole thing, like saying someone's not a legit black belt because they get submitted in a fight is not humble. Saying your opponent's not a legit black belt is not humble. It's not, because on the one hand, it's like kind of silly. It's like, well, that just doesn't negate someone's black belt. That doesn't mean they're not good enough to have a black belt. I mean, some of the best jiu-jitsu people of all time have gotten submitted in MMA fights, okay? Adolfo Fierro got submitted by Fluffy Hernandez. Adolfo Fierro is a world champion, you know? Ricardo Almeida got submitted by Matt Hughes. Ricardo Almeida is, like, a world champion. Like, this happens, okay? So that's just shit-talking. That's just, like, shitting on your opponent. And it's funny, and and I don't mind, like, them as sort of judo, sambo wrestler guys who've, like, learned jiu-jitsu after all that. I don't mind them sort of rubbing it in that they can submit jiu-jitsu black belts. I don't mind that. But again, that's because I don't mind trash talking. I don't mind some friendly, some kind of mean banter between competitors. I don't mind that at all. But it's not humble, okay? Like, similarly, Khabib, and this is maybe like the worst example to me, or it's the one that like stands out most in my mind. If we rewind the clock a bit and we think back to when Khabib was supposed to fight Tony Ferguson for the millionth time, it didn't end up happening. This was for a vacant belt, and I'm sure we all know that Khabib ultimately ended up fighting Al Iaquinta for the vacant belt and beating him. But there was a point in like the week leading up where he was actually going to fight Max Holloway on short notice. And Max Holloway was the reigning featherweight champ. This was like peak Holloway era. If I recall correctly, it was coming off of his win over Brian Ortega, where he just like appeared to level up. He like, this is the first time that he broke the record for most strikes landed in a fight. Like, this is the one where he famously is like beating the shit out of Ortega and like reaching out and like showing him where to put his hands in order to block the punches. It was after that fight, and Khabib was not the champion. He was a contender. He was undefeated. You know, he was everyone's favorite to become the champion, but he was not the champion. And so that's the context. It's like height of Holloway in his title reign, and it's Khabib as just a contender. And nevertheless, in the press conference, Khabib was being very dismissive, and he just said to Holloway straight up, like, dude, there's no way you actually believe you can win. Like, you actually think you can win? You actually think you can beat me? He was saying things like that, and you could tell it, like, flabbergasted Holloway, because not that he couldn't, like, conceive of someone, like, trash-talking him, but, like, intellectually, it just so clearly was, like, like disrupting his thought process, because he was just like, dude, I'm a world champion. Like, what do you mean I wouldn't believe I could beat you? Like, what the fuck are you saying? Like, Holloway was really put off by it. And rightfully so, because it's like, yeah, of course he thinks he can beat you. Like, he not only is he a fighter, not only is he a professional fighter, not only is he a UFC fighter, and believing you can beat people is just required, to be a competitor at that level. But he is a reigning world champion. Of course he fucking thinks he can beat you. Like, what? Like, insanity. And again, when he's the reigning champion, and where you're a contender, like, so that, again, that is arrogant. That is not humble. It simply is not. And that fight didn't end up happening because Holloway had like a weight cutting issue, and yeah, it led to the Al Iaquinta fight. And Khabib should have been the favorite to beat Holloway, don't get me wrong. But, like, that, nevertheless, that is a very arrogant and not humble thing to say to your opponent. And, again, like, I don't mind. But I'm calling balls and strikes here. That's not humble. Another example was, like, Umar versus Merab. And this was amusing because, Umar was being very dismissive of Merab. and so was his camp. And there was a press conference where Merab actually said to him, because they're bickering over like whether who's going to get the takedowns and whether Merab's going to win, whether he's going to, he only needed to get a couple takedowns to like break the record or something like that. And they were bickering about that. And Umar was being very dismissive. And Merab was just kind of laughing. And he said, "You will be humbled, my friend." Merab said that to Umar. "You will be humbled, my friend." And then he proceeded to, of course, beat him and break the record. And so that's not being humble. Like it literally provoked Merab to say, "You will be humbled," because you're not acting humbly. And then after the fact, like being sore losers, like making excuses, like not being graceful in defeat, which the camp was not after Umar lost. And that's fine. Like these are not like horrible sins in my book, but like it's just not humble. And what I think's funny about this whole thing is that like we have examples of fighters who are just aggressively humble, who are like paragons of humility. Like we have Lyoto Machida, we have Stephen Thompson, like even Tom Aspinall is just like a profoundly humble dude, and like clearly has to be like pressured to shit talk, and is just constantly saying things like, "Oh, DC would beat me," and he's always giving credit to his opponents and saying that they're going to be hard fights, and he just carries himself like a humble guy. And like these examples, Machida, Thompson, Aspinall. Another thing is they don't say they're humble. They don't pat themselves on the back for being humble. They don't preach humility constantly. They just walk the walk. And, again, like I said, there's a reason that Khabib and company preach humility. It's because it's a cornerstone of the faith, and it's a thing that needs to be reinforced constantly. It's not just random. It's not just a PR thing. But nevertheless, I'm just saying, like, there is a massive gap in humility from a sportsman point of view between someone like Lyoto Machida and someone like Khabib. There simply is. And, so that's my thought on that. But there is a flip side to this, and there's a sense in which when they preach humility, they are walking the walk, where humility is a part of like the way of life for Khabib and his team. And it's not the public like statements about their opponents and about themselves and stuff like that. It's in the lifestyle. It's in the training. It's in the fact that they train as hard as they do, that they put themselves through the ringer in their fight camps, and that they're willing to like put their nose to the grindstone. Like I remember listening to the Mexican martial artist, the YouTuber. He was talking about Khabib and Islam and why he was kind of going on about why those guys are so good and why they're better than the competitors. And one of the things he mentioned was like, you don't see those guys getting lost in like social media bullshit. You don't see those guys starting their own podcasts. You don't see them starting their own YouTube channels. You don't see that stuff. Whereas you see other fighters, like Aspinall, like Kamaru Usman, like scores of fighters who are still active fighters, who will do that. They'll go that path. And Volkanovski, like there's just tons of fighters will create YouTube channels, podcasts, etc., whilst they're still fighting. And that, I'm not saying that's like career ending. I'm not saying it's impossible to balance those things, just like it's not impossible to balance having a wife and children with being a fighter. But nevertheless, that is a distraction. And that is a sort of a different thing you're chasing. That's not just going to the fucking gym every day and getting your shit done. It's sort of like what Dorian Yates, the bodybuilder, talks about, where part of his success was that he kept to himself and he wasn't like a public persona, and he just lived in like a shitty apartment and he just ate, slept, and fucking breathed his bodybuilding lifestyle. And other bodybuilders like weren't doing that. And it's a similar thing with Khabib and Islam. And you can tell when Khabib talks about training that that's very important. And he's telling his dudes like, stay humble. Like, remember the grind, remember the work. Like, don't get lost in celebrity. Don't think you're king shit. Remember the work and come to the fucking training room and humble yourself by getting your fucking ass kicked every day. And that's a very real kind of humility. And Khabib and his team walk that fucking walk. So in that sense, they're extremely humble. I think. And additionally, I think there's like that is attached to just their broader culture and their community, where it's like, remember where you came from. You know, Khabib didn't do the Conor McGregor thing. He didn't like get rich from fighting and then buy a yacht and travel the world and go get a million cars and yada yada. And I'm sure I don't know what he does with his money. I'm sure he's got nice things, but like he still lives in Dagestan and he runs his fucking father's gym and he's teaching the youth and he's teaching his teammates and he's coaching. Like that is humble, because he could just go be a rock star. He doesn't need to do that shit anymore. You know, he doesn't need to touch the sport again. He's retired and he's a celebrity and he's rich. He doesn't need to do any of this, but he's humbling himself by like walking in his fucking father's footsteps and carrying on his legacy and helping the community and remembering where he fucking came from and remembering his roots. Like, that's humble. And again, in a very real way, in a very deep way, that is humble. So that's kind of everything I got on that. Like, I think it's an interesting topic because I think it's interesting culturally, it's interesting religiously, and it's interesting because Khabib and the camp, in some very real ways, they don't act humble at all. They act arrogant. They shit talk their opponents and dismiss them and their skills. And, you know, sometimes it's true. Sometimes it's not even that. And in every case, it's not humble. It's arrogant. And I don't mind because it's funny. And I don't mind because it adds some spice when fighters shit talk each other. You know, so I'm going to call that for what it is, which is not fucking humble. But in this other sense, and probably in a much more important sense, which is remembering where you come from and remembering what got you success and remembering the work and passing it on, they're very humble. They're extremely humble. So that's what I think about that. And I just wanted to weigh in because I've seen, since Islam won, I've seen some videos and some comment sections where people have been going on about this, and, you know, it's not the first time that this debate has been had with that camp. So I thought I'd weigh in because I think that's a pretty fair assessment of the situation. So that's what I got.